In the autumn of 1453, 6 months after Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces, a messenger arrived at the convent of the Theotokos in the hills above Thessaloniki, carrying a letter sealed with the mark of the Byzantine Patriarch. Sister Theodora, the abbess, who had led the community for 23 years, broke the seal with hands that she tried to keep steady. She read the letter once, then read it again, then looked up at the 37 women gathered in the chapel, waiting for her to speak. The letter was brief. It informed them that all remaining Byzantine territories in the region would soon be under Ottoman control. It advised that convents should evacuate immediately, that the sisters should scatter to their families, or flee west to Venice or Rome while there was still time. It acknowledged that many would choose to stay, to keep their vows, to trust in divine protection. And then, in words that seemed to struggle to convey their meaning even as they were written, it warned, "What follows is not martyrdom in the old sense. It is something else, something that takes longer, something that leaves you alive." Sister Theodora did not share that final sentence with her sisters. Instead, she told them they would vote on whether to flee or to remain. The vote took place the next morning after prayers. 34 sisters chose to stay, bound by their vows and by faith that God would protect his faithful servants. 3 younger women, barely 20 years old, chose to attempt the journey west. Theodora gave them what money the convent possessed and watched them leave at dawn, wondering if she would ever learn whether they reached safety. 14 days later, Ottoman forces reached the convent. And what happened to Sister Theodora and the women who stayed with her? What happened to thousands of nuns across dozens of convents throughout the collapsing Byzantine territories over the following decades reveals something about conquest and faith and systematic oppression that historical records preserved in fragmentary form across Ottoman archives, Vatican correspondence, and scattered accounts from ransomed captives. What you're about to learn is not legend or exaggeration. It's documented in sources that historians have been reluctant to discuss in detail because the systematic nature of what occurred seems almost designed to destroy not just bodies, but souls, not just individuals, but the very concept of religious resistance. If you want to understand how conquest worked, not just on battlefields, but in the methodical destruction of faith and identity, how women religious were specifically targeted as symbols of defeated Christianity, how systematic methods of conversion and erasure operated across decades and territories, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now because what you're about to discover goes far beyond simple violence into territory that reveals the calculated methods empires use to destroy resistance by targeting the most sacred institutions of conquered peoples. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what you already know about the fall of Byzantium, because I guarantee this goes deeper and darker than anything you learned in history class. Now let me tell you what happened when the Ottoman soldiers reached the convent of the Theotokos, because understanding this specific case helps us understand the patterns that were repeated across the collapsing Byzantine world. The Ottoman forces that arrived at the convent were not a random raiding party, but a structured military unit operating under specific orders regarding how to handle religious institutions in newly conquered territories. The commander was a man named Mehmed Bey, and according to Ottoman military records preserved in the archives of Istanbul, he had been specifically instructed on how to deal with Christian monastic communities. These instructions were not about simple destruction. The Ottomans were building an empire, not just conducting raids, and empire building required more sophisticated approaches to conquered populations. When Mehmed Bey's forces reached the convent gates, they did not immediately attack. Instead, the commander sent a messenger to inform the abbess that the convent was now under Ottoman authority and that the inhabitants had 3 choices. They could convert to Islam and be integrated into Ottoman society with certain protections. They could pay jizya tax and continue practicing Christianity under specific restrictions, or they could face the consequences designated for those who resisted the Sultan's authority. Sister Theodora, standing at the gate with several of her sisters behind her, gave the answer that her vows demanded. "We are the brides of Christ. We cannot accept another faith, and we possess nothing with which to pay tribute. Our lives are in God's hands." The commander's response was immediate and methodical. Ottoman forces broke through the convent gates using tools they had brought specifically for this purpose, not cannon, which would be excessive for such a small target, but heavy timbers used as battering rams and axes to break the wooden doors. The assault took less than an hour. By sunset, the convent was under Ottoman control, and the sisters were gathered in the courtyard. What happened next followed a pattern that appears repeatedly in historical records from this period. The women were not immediately harmed or violated. Instead, they were held in the courtyard under guard, while the Ottoman forces systematically searched the convent for several things: valuables that could be confiscated as legitimate spoils of war, religious items that would be catalogued and either destroyed or sent to Ottoman authorities as evidence of the conquest, and documentation, letters, records, anything that might reveal connections to resistance movements or to Western powers. The sisters spent that first night in the courtyard, forbidden from entering the chapel or their cells, given minimal food and water, subjected to what we would now recognize as a deliberate process of disorientation and demoralization. They were surrounded by soldiers speaking a language most of them didn't understand. They could see smoke rising from inside the convent, where soldiers were burning items considered heretical. They could hear the sounds of destruction as furnishings were broken apart and structures were damaged. They were being forced to witness the desecration of everything they had dedicated their lives to protecting. This first phase, the initial capture, and the night of disorientation was described in a letter written years later by one of the 3 sisters who had chosen to flee west. She had maintained correspondence with a family in Thessaloniki, who through various channels learned fragments of what happened and passed this information to Venice, where it eventually reached her. The letter, preserved in Venetian archives, describes how the psychological assault began before any physical harm, how the women were made to feel powerless and abandoned before the next phase of their ordeal began. On the second day, the systematic processing began. This is where we need to understand that the Ottoman Empire had developed sophisticated methods for dealing with conquered populations, methods that were more complex than simple violence or destruction. The empire needed to establish control, extract resources, and prevent future resistance, and these goals required different approaches for different types of conquered peoples. For nuns, women who had taken vows of celibacy and dedicated themselves to Christian religious life, the Ottoman authorities had specific policies that were designed to achieve several objectives simultaneously. First, these women represented powerful symbols of Christian faith and resistance. Converting them or breaking them served propaganda purposes, demonstrating that even the most dedicated Christians would ultimately submit to Ottoman power. Second, many of these women came from wealthy or influential families, making them potentially valuable for ransom or for forcing cooperation from their relatives. Third, the knowledge that nuns faced specific fates after capture served to terrorize other Christian communities into surrendering without resistance. The sisters of the Theotokos convent were separated into groups based on age and apparent health. The oldest women over 50, who would be considered too old for certain purposes, were separated first. The youngest and healthiest women, roughly between 15 and 35, were placed in a second group. Those in between were divided based on apparent strength and condition. This categorization process was methodical and recorded with Ottoman scribes, noting down numbers and basic descriptions. Each group faced different fates, and understanding these different trajectories helps us understand the systematic nature of how the Ottoman Empire processed, captured religious women. The eldest group, including Sister Theodora, who was 56 years old, was given one final opportunity to convert. An interpreter explained that if they would recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, they would be allowed to live out their remaining years in relative peace, possibly in service to Ottoman households where their literacy and domestic skills would be valued. Every single woman in this group refused. Sister Theodora's response, recorded by the interpreter in his report, was, "I have been Christ's bride for 34 years. I will not abandon him in my final years to purchase a few more breaths of air." The other elderly sisters expressed similar sentiments, their refusals ranging from simple no to more elaborate declarations of faith. The Ottoman commander response to these refusals was neither immediate execution nor torture in the conventional sense. Instead, these women were confined to a section of the convent that had been damaged during the initial assault, given minimal food and water, and essentially left to survive or not, as their bodies determined. This was not mercy, but calculated cruelty, allowing them to die slowly from deprivation rather than making martyrs through quick execution. Ottoman records indicate this approach was preferred for elderly religious captives because it avoided creating symbolic martyrs while still achieving the goal of eliminating resistance. Sister Theodora died 17 days after the convent fell, according to accounts that eventually reached Venice. She was buried in an unmarked location somewhere in the hills around Thessaloniki, her grave never identified or marked with any Christian symbol. The other elderly sisters died over the following weeks, their deaths attributed in Ottoman records simply to natural causes following capture, a bureaucratic euphemism that appears repeatedly in documents from this period. But it was the younger sisters, the women of childbearing age who were healthy and strong, who faced the fates that historical sources describe in terms suggesting they were considered worse than death. Let me tell you about what happened to them, because this is where the systematic nature of Ottoman policy toward captured religious women becomes most evident and most disturbing. The 23 younger sisters, ranging in age from 16 to 38, were placed under guard and prepared for transport. Unlike the elderly sisters who were left in place, these women were considered valuable enough to be sent to Constantinople, where their fates would be determined by higher Ottoman authorities. The journey itself was designed as part of their psychological breaking. They would be marched for days across territories that had once been Christian, but were now under Ottoman control. Visible symbols of defeated Christianity being paraded before populations who needed to understand that resistance was futile. Before the march began, the women were stripped of their religious habits, the distinctive clothing that marked them as nuns, and dressed in simple, rough garments. Their heads were shorn or uncovered, violating the customs of modesty they had observed their entire religious lives. They were bound together with ropes, not tightly enough to prevent walking, but enough to make clear that they were prisoners without freedom of movement, and they were placed under the guard of soldiers who had been specifically instructed regarding how to treat them. Here we need to understand something important about Ottoman policy that appears consistently in historical records. There were rules, procedures, and bureaucratic structures governing how conquered peoples were treated. This was not simply chaos or individual soldiers acting on impulse. The Ottoman Empire had developed systematic approaches to processing captives, and these approaches were implemented with remarkable consistency across different campaigns in different regions. For captured Christian religious women, the rules were specific. They were not to be violated or abused during transport in ways that would damage their value as potential converts or as ransom subjects. They were to be kept alive and relatively healthy. They were to be psychologically intimidated and demoralized, but not physically destroyed. These rules existed not out of mercy, but out of calculated imperial policy. These women were assets to be processed, not resources to be carelessly destroyed. The march from Thessaloniki to Constantinople took 12 days, according to records that documented the movement of military units and captives during this period. The sisters walked between 15 and 20 memorod per day, given minimal food and water, sleeping on the ground at night under guard, forbidden from speaking to each other or from praying aloud. When they tried to pray silently or to comfort each other through gestures, they were struck with sticks, not severely enough to cause serious injury, but enough to establish that even these small resistances would be punished. One account that survived from this period comes from a merchant named Paolo Contarini, a Venetian who was traveling through Ottoman territories under safe passage, and who witnessed a